All right, everyone, welcome to another episode of Just One Man Revelation Edition. So today we are going to we're going to call this Revelation 6, the Olivet Discourse. So as we begin our examination of the events of Daniel's 70th seven, better known as the 7-year tribulation period on earth, and according to Daniel 9, its purpose is focused on the Jewish nation and their old covenant. This time of tribulation would bring the nation to its knees and ultimately to Christ, and that's its ultimate purpose, to bring the nation of Israel to a recognition that Jesus was and is their Messiah. Now, last episode, we saw John. He's in heaven witnessing Jesus preparing to open the scroll, the land deed, since he is the right judge over the land of Israel and the world. And the opening of the scroll will drive the events of tribulation described in chapters 6 through 18. So as we move into chapter 6, we have more questions to explore. Or one more question to explore, one that holds a great amount of interest for Christians today and probably even non-Christians. And that question centers around the timing of the end. Now, we already learned that the timing of Jesus' second coming can be known precisely. Okay, his second coming, because it will be 7 years after the signing of a covenant. And we learned already that the timing of Jesus' second coming after the signing of that covenant, that's told to us in Daniel 9 because it says that it will be between a certain world leader and Israel's leaders to permit Israel to have a temple, and that is what is going to kick off the start of tribulation, Daniel's final 7-year period. And we know that the church has to be removed prior to that time, but the timing of our removal, i.e. the rapture, that's a complete mystery. But despite the fact that the church's removal date's unknown, we do know it's closely tied to the start of tribulation because according to the outline of Revelation, the end of the church age takes us to the things that happen after. So, if there are signs that the end of the age is upon us, then it would also be an alert to the church that our removal is approaching too. And as it turns out, the Bible does tell us the signs that we should look to, or that we should look for to indicate the end of the age. And we find them in a passage in Matthew chapter 24. And it says, Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple building to him. And he said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen? What will be a sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So this scene occurs 2 days before Jesus' trial and death. Okay, he's arrived in Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and since then, he's been spending days teaching in the temple court. At night, he leaves the temple and the city to spend it in Bethany on the other side of the Mount of Olives, and that's where he's headed on this night, eastward toward the Mount of Olives. Now, he's probably thinking about the end of his life, what he must endure, and the disciples, they're just oblivious to what's about to happen. So they're like sightseeing, remarking on the impressive temple building. And keep in mind that Herod's temple was one of the most impressive construction projects ever undertaken in all of history. The massive foundation stones are so large that we still have trouble conceiving how they were constructed and moved so precisely. Insert the History Channel alien guy. And that building took a long time to finish. It wasn't completed until like almost 40 years after Jesus' death, only to be destroyed a few years later. So naturally, these men, they're fascinated by this. But as they point out the building to Jesus, he responds with very serious words. He provocatively says that this massive building will be torn down stone by stone, which was really, really hard to believe. And yet, if it were true, it must mean that the end of the world had come, or so it would seem. So Jesus' comment resulted in the disciples going silent for the rest of the walk to Bethany. But once they get to their resting place, they decide they have to know more about these matters. So they ask Jesus a series of questions. Matthew records three questions. When will these things, i.e., the temple destruction, happen? What will the sign, what will be the sign of your coming? What will be signs of the end of the age? And now Luke's account of this conversation records one additional question in chapter 21, verse 7. They question him, saying, Teacher, when therefore will these things happen? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? So Luke adds an additional detail to the first question. They wanted to know the signs that the temple destruction was about to take place, probably so they could make sure that they got out of the way. So putting both passages together, we end up with the following question. 1, when will the temple destruction take place? 1a, what are the signs of the temple's coming destruction? Question 2, what will be the sign of your coming? Question 3, what will be the signs of the end of the age? Now, we're not going to cover questions 1 and 1a here. In question 2, we'll actually talk about that a little bit later. But what follows in Matthew 24 are Jesus' answers to those questions. But in order to interpret them properly, we have to notice two important details. First, Jesus is going to add an additional question that the disciples didn't even think to ask. He inserts a commentary on what are not signs of the end, making a total of 5 questions. And that makes sense, especially when you notice the type of signs that Jesus gives. Several of the signs are easily confused with ordinary everyday events. So the second thing we must note is that Jesus didn't answer these questions in the same order that they asked him. Instead, Jesus chooses to provide his answers in a different order that better suits his purpose. So he actually answers them in the order of 4, which is the additional question that Jesus inserts for them that they didn't think to ask. 3, 1, 1a, and then 2. And the context of the chapter reveals this different order, but only if we're paying careful attention to the text. So Jesus then begins to answer the question the disciples didn't ask, what are not signs of the end? And that's in Matthew 24, verse 4. And Jesus answered and said to them, See to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. And then in Luke chapter 21, verse 8, and he said, See to it that you are not misled. For many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is near. Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and disturbances, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end does not follow immediately. So Jesus' first warning is that no one in the church be misled into believing that Jesus had already returned. It will happen that many will come in Jesus' name saying they are Christ, and they will succeed in misleading many, but we shouldn't be misled. So people are saying that Jesus has come are always going to be wrong, so we can always ignore them. When Jesus does come back, he's going to bring us with him, so we can't miss that. Therefore, we can safely ignore such nonsense, and it's not a sign of the end. Next, Jesus says, Don't be worried over wars or rumors of wars. There will be constant wars and rumors of wars in this age, but the mere presence of war is not a sign of anything. And rumors that war will start between Iran and Israel, or Russia and Israel, or anyone else are meaningless and should be ignored. These things are not yet the end, and the end doesn't follow immediately. So then Jesus begins to answer their questions. And he starts with question 3. What are the signs of the end of the age? Now, because we looked back at Daniel in an episode, we now understand what Jesus and the disciples meant when they said the end of the age. They were speaking about the age that Daniel defined for us as the age of the Gentiles. So Jesus now begins to tell us what signs will announce that this current age is coming to an end. Back to Matthew 24, verse 7. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. So the signs of the end of the age will act like birth pangs, Jesus says. So we got to understand a little of how birth pangs work if we're to appreciate how these signs will work. Now, first, we know that birth pangs are quite painful, or at least that's how it is perceived when we watch women give birth. I've obviously never done that, so I can't verify that, but it looks incredibly painful. And these birth pangs, they are intensely painful contractions that interrupt normal life for the woman. So are the signs of the end of the age. They will be painful experiences for the world, and they will interrupt normal life in every imaginable way. Second, we know that birth pangs can start very mildly, even imperceptibly. Some women can think that their birth pangs aren't real at first, so it will be with the signs at the end of the age. They'll start mildly. Many will not notice or recognize the signs of them. Thirdly, we know that birth pangs increase in severity as time progresses. Contractions get stronger and stronger, and so it will be with the signs of the end of the age, as the signs repeat themselves over and over, but as they repeat, they will get stronger and more severe. The damage will become. The fourth thing about birth pangs is the increase in frequency, right? They get closer together, and the closer together the contractions, the closer the woman is to the end. And so it will be with these signs also, as they repeat closer and closer together, and that increasing frequency is a sign that the end is approaching. And then finally, they ultimately lead to birth of a new life, and that's where we are headed to in these signs. As the pains on earth increase and the end approaches, so does Christ's return and the start of the kingdom. And at that point, a new world and a new life for Israel and all believers will begin. So that's the comparison that Jesus offers for the signs of the end of the age. And so now let's look at these specific signs. In verse 7, Jesus says that the nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. Now, that sounds a lot like war, yet Jesus said not to look for war. So it's got to be something different about this war. And the answer comes from understanding this phrase in a historical context. In Jesus' day, this term was used in the culture as a euphemism for a certain type of war. The term means world war, or a war involving all nations and kingdoms on earth. Now, this is a rare and unique type of war, and in fact, prior to the 20th century, it had never happened before. 1914, Europe entered into war because of pacts and alliances, and that war eventually dragged most of the earth into the fight. Altogether, 88% of the world's nations participated in World War I at some levels. Ironically, it was supposed to be the war to end all wars, but it wasn't, because World War II was even stronger, worse than the earlier one. It involved 95% of the world's nations. So, like a birth pangs would predict. Now we know why Jesus specifically ruled out wars in his earlier answer. He didn't want us mistaking ordinary war for the unique world wars that would mark the end. We've seen two so far, which means we've entered the period of the end, and we should expect to see worse, far worse. Now, the next sign of the end of the age is famine in various places. Now, famine is also common on earth. So, to understand the sign, we must also consider it in light of the birth pain comparison. When the end of the age approaches, famines won't just be common, they'll be the norm. And they won't just impact some people, but everyone. That's what Jesus means by various places. He means in places you aren't expecting to see it happen. And they will be more severe and painful than anything we've seen before. So it will be by the increasing severity and frequency that people can see famines as a sign of the end. But remember, in the beginning of birth pangs, they can also be mild, that it's kind of hard to notice. And so it will be with famine. The initial stages of this sign will be subtle, overlooked, at least at first. Today, there are indicators that famine is growing in severity and frequency and impacting more people than ever before. Even some industrialized nations have begun to experience food shortages for various reasons. Food prices are steadily increasing, supplies are running short, inventories in grocery stores are also limited and dependent on regular resupply. So as we move further towards the end, this sign will only increase. And then finally, Jesus says to look for earthquakes to increase. And since measuring earthquakes is a science, then it's pretty easy to track the fulfillment of this sign. A search at the USGS website reveals trends in earthquakes in the US and worldwide over the past century and more. And this data shows a general rise in earthquake activity worldwide in recent decades. In particular, the number of high-intensity earthquakes in the US have increased dramatically in the past 3 decades. States like Oklahoma and Arkansas have seen unexplainable rises in earthquake activity on an order of magnitude. These are not normal variations, and they have scientists stumped. The average number of high intensity earthquakes per decade in the prior century was 110, and it remained pretty consistent from decade to decade. But in the first decade of the 21st century, that number increases to over 150. And in the second decade of this century, we've already recorded 165. So that's a 43% increase over the steady pattern of the 1900s. So world wars, famine, earthquakes tells us we're near the end of the age, and they will follow a pattern of birth pangs getting worse and more frequent as time goes on. So, what does this tell us about what to expect in the tribulation? Well, we should expect to see these signs getting far worse. And in fact, that's what we find as we look at the first events that even start tribulation. Those first events will be more of the same of these signs, just far worse. So, altogether, before tribulation begins, right now, what we studied so far, we have 7 signs that the world will receive to know they are at the end of the age. Jesus gave us world wars, famines, earthquakes in the Olivet Discourse. Earlier, we learned about the church experiencing apostasy. Daniel said there would be 10 kings ruling and a covenant signed with Israel to allow sacrifices. And of course, we know the church will be removed at resurrection. But then there are 2 more signs that precede the tribulation and announce the end of this age, and announce that the end of the age is near. First, in Ezekiel chapter 20, that tells us of a coming regathering of Israel. Ezekiel says that the people of Israel will be regathered from where they were scattered, and they will re-enter the land of Israel. And they will regather specifically so that they might be there to endure the coming tribulation. It will be a time of judgment against the people of Israel, as when the Lord dealt with their forefathers in the desert. And as a result of being made to pass under the rod of chastisement, the people of Israel will come back into the bond of the covenant. The covenant in view here is the old covenant, which is the agreement that mandates these penalties. So once again, we have evidence that the tribulation is intended for Israel. So in preparation for that judgment, they're regathered. Finally, in Malachi chapter 4, that tells us of a mysterious Old Testament character who will return to Israel before tribulation. Malachi tells Israel that a day of fire, burning, and judgment is coming to the earth, which is a reference to the devastation of tribulation. In Malachi chapter 4, verse 5, the prophet calls this time the great and terrible day of the Lord, which we studied in previous episodes. And Malachi says that he will send the prophet Elijah with the J before that day. Elijah was perhaps the most revered prophet of the Old Testament, and his life ended in a mysterious way, leaving the earth in a chariot of fire without having experienced physical death. That leads to much speculation about why God treated Elijah so uniquely, and Malachi tells us that the reason is because Elijah's ministry on earth isn't finished. He will return to Israel to restore the hearts of fathers to children and children to their fathers. Now, this cryptic phrase refers to Israel inspired by Elijah's appearance to return to orthodoxy. Today, Jews are generally not following the law and certainly aren't sacrificing animals as required. Without a temple, they can't sacrifice. But even if they had a temple, few would probably embrace this notion. In fact, if mass animal slaughter took place again at the temple, we can imagine that probably many of the Jews would be picketing in protest, right? But yet, the reestablishment of a temple and of sacrifice will be very important in the last days. The tribulation itself begins because Israel strikes a deal with a certain man to regain access to their Temple Mount to sacrifice. And unless Israel signs such an agreement, the tribulation can't begin and the age can't end. And if Israel isn't interested in sacrifice, then they're not going to be interested in an opportunity to build a temple. So the Lord brings Elijah back to his people to motivate them to pursue the law zealously again. The effect is a revival of orthodoxy among Jews worldwide, with a new desire to seek for a temple and for sacrifice under the law, and that sets the stage for the signing of the covenant that starts the clock on the final 7-year period of the age. So altogether, we now have 9 signs to look for that tell us we've reached the end of this age. Among all these 9 signs, how many have already come to pass in our day? Well, we can count 5 or 6 as fulfilled or in the process of fulfillment. Okay, so that just leaves the 10 kings coming to power, church being removed, and of course the final sign is the covenant being signed itself and Elijah coming back. So interestingly, though, this the final sign of this covenant itself, it's not captured anywhere in the Bible. We simply know it must happen because Daniel says so. And in Revelation 6, we see the effects of that moment, though we don't see the moment itself. And that is where we will go now into the start of tribulation in chapter 6. Now, the tribulation itself can be broken down into 3 parts. You got the first half, the middle, and the second half. And each part plays a distinct role in the events of the 7 years. The first half is covered in chapters 6 through 9. The events of mid-tribulation, the dividing point in the 7 years, those are covered in chapters 10 through 15. And then the final events of the 7 years, called the Great Tribulation, those are covered in chapters 16 through 19. So we'll study the book chapter by chapter, but we'll also consider each section of the book according to these 3 parts. So let's jump right in, starting off with chapter 6 and the first half of tribulation, Revelation 6, verse 1. And then I saw the Lamb broke one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say as with a voice of thunder, "Come." I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. All right, so John opens up chapter 6 with the word then, which in Hebrew is kai, which means this is the next thing he witnessed. So remember the scene that we left at the end of chapter 5. Jesus is in the throne room. He's holding the land deed to earth. As he breaks the first seal, one of the 4 living creatures says to John, "Come." The meaning in this context is to look away from his immediate surroundings and gaze down upon the earth. This begins a common pattern in the book of Revelation. John is witness to events in heaven. He's been transported there in a vision, so he describes what he sees there. But the events that happen in heaven will usually result in a response on earth, so when the angels want John to record the resulting events on earth, they tell him to come, meaning to come and look at the effect. Now, the opening of the first 4 seals will result in the appearing of a different horse on earth, each a different color and with a different effect. These horses and their riders are commonly called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. We have no reason to doubt that John saw 4 horses just as he wrote, but it's also apparent that these 4 horses are symbolic. The variation in color and the description of what they do confirm they represent other events happening on earth. This will become apparent as we look at each one. So, looking at the first horse, John says it's white, and it carries an unnamed rider, only addressed as he. Now, last time we saw an unnamed he mentioned in an apocalyptic passage about the end of the age was in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. In that earlier passage, the he was a reference back to the little horn, the Antichrist of the last days. So we need to see if there is any connection to this he. John says the rider arrives with a bow, but he doesn't mention any arrows. It's like pointing a gun at somebody not having any bullets. When someone waves a gun at you, you're intimidated because it suggests an attack. But since you don't know if the person has the capacity to carry out this threat, you must assume that they can. So you are persuaded to comply, even though in reality they lack the firepower. So in this case, the man with the bow suggests someone who threatens harm but lacks the capacity to carry it out fully. Next, he also has a crown, a Stephanos, which is a crown you earn or receive in recognition for your achievements. So he doesn't have the crown of a natural born king, which in Greek the word would be diadem. And we remember that Daniel told us that the 11th horn would not be one of the original 10 world leaders. So in this case, Stephanos suggests a man of either military or political power. And a white horse is traditionally the type of horse ridden by a military commander or a conquering leader. So the very first act of tribulation will be Jesus setting loose a man upon the earth who goes forth conquering and to conquer. Now, going out implies out into the world, all over, and conquering and to conquer implies that he begins to take control, but this process takes time. He doesn't finish his conquering in a moment, but he progresses towards that goal over a period of time, and all these details work in harmony to what's happening on earth as the first seal is broken. The man earns his authority over a period of time, but more by the threat of conquest than by actual military power. Since we know the tribulation begins with the signing of an agreement brokered by a powerful world leader, this open seal fits perfectly. Here we have an aspiring world leader who's not yet a king, but still possesses power to intimidate. And as he rides out conquering, his power base grows. And back in Daniel 9:26, we learn that this man would come from a certain people. The temple was foretold to be destroyed by the people of the prince who is to come. So the Antichrist is one of the same people as those who destroyed the temple, which was the Roman army. Since the Roman Empire dissolved, we can't identify the prince of this people except to say he must be Gentile. Now he might also be European or Middle Eastern. So when Jesus breaks this first seal, this man is launched on his career of conquest. And that moment begins with the signing of a peace covenant with Israel, allowing them access to the Temple Mount. And it's not hard to understand how that would launch a man's world career. I mean, imagine how the world would respond to a world leader who could broker peace in the Middle East between Jews and Arabs. But it's clear that Jesus is the true power here. It's his breaking of the seal that makes the peace come, if only temporarily. What else can we learn from Scripture about this man who launches the world into tribulation? Well, the Bible gives this coming world leader a variety of names, from seed of serpent to little horn to a prince to the lawless one. But the title we all know best is the one the Apostle John gave us in his letters. John calls this man the Antichrist, or the Antichristos, which means one who opposes Christ. Now, in light of how many different ways the Bible describes this character, we're going to take just a moment to understand who he is. Even John himself uses the term Antichrist in at least a few different ways. So let's begin with John's famous term. 1 John 2:22 reads, "Who is the liar but the one who denies that Jesus is the Christ?" This is the Antichrist, the one who denies the Father and the Son. So in this reference, John teaches that a person who denies Jesus is the Christ is the Antichrist. So to say Jesus isn't the Messiah is to oppose Christ, and in that sense, everyone who stands opposed to Jesus is a type of Antichrist. This is why Paul describes unbelievers as enemies of Christ until we are reconciled by grace. Or as Jesus says, that those who are not with him are against him. Everyone who denies Jesus as Lord is acting as an Antichrist. That's why my English version, the translators chose not to capitalize Antichrist in this passage. They knew John was talking generally. They understood he wasn't talking about the Antichrist. So now let's look at another mention by John, 1 John chapter 2, verse 18. Children, in the last hour, and just as you heard that Antichrist is coming, and now many Antichrists have appeared, from this we know that it is the last hour. Now in this passage, John uses both a singular and a plural reference to Antichrist. In the first instance, translators should capitalize the word Antichrist, though a lot of translations don't do that. This is not the same Antichrist as the one John mentioned in earlier verse, because there he said many Antichrists exist. So anyone who denies Jesus is Christ is an Antichrist in that sense. But here John says Antichrist is coming, yet he wasn't on the scene yet. There's a singular Antichrist, someone that the church was told to expect. But then in the second instance, the word becomes plural again, and John says there are already many antichrists in the world. And this reference is similar to the one that we just talked about a minute ago. People who deny Jesus is the Christ are the Antichrist of our world. And ultimately, we will have one man who opposes Christ in a unique way and with a unique power. And this one man will be the Antichrist. So there is an Antichrist to come. And in the meantime, we have Antichrists who deny that Jesus is Christ. Now, in other scriptures, John mentions the spirit of the Antichrist, and a spirit is a spirit that is both in the world now and is coming. And this spirit is the cause behind every person who doesn't confess Jesus is from God. Now, we know that the spirit of a person who doesn't confess Jesus as Christ is corrupt, fallen, and therefore unbelieving. But what spirit is responsible for producing this unwillingness to believe the truth, both now and in the future? Now, clearly, John's talking about Satan, who is the spirit of the Antichrist, both now and in the future. Today, Satan is the spirit of the Antichrist in the sense that Satan is responsible for producing generation after generation of God deniers. But in a day to come, Satan will also be the spirit responsible for raising up one man above all others in opposing Christ. And Paul tells us what this man will do as he rises to power in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 3. He says, "Let no one in that way deceive you, for it will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes a seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God." So Paul says, in the day of the Lord or tribulation, will not come unless the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction. He's called a son because he is the son or seed of Satan, and he exalts himself above every so-called God or any other object of worship. That means he will claim to be a god above Muhammad, Buddha, or any other pagan god you can think of. Eventually, he takes the seat in the temple of God, displaying himself to be God. Now we see some themes converging because this reminds us of what Daniel 9 told us. This man will be responsible for allowing sacrifices to restart on the Temple Mount. That results in Israel building a temple, which Elijah has helped encourage the nation to use. But Daniel told us in chapter 9, verse 27, that this man who brokered the agreement with Israel will go back on his agreement after 3.5 years, which is mid-tribulation. And Paul says that he will decide at that point that he is God, and so he even takes his seat in the temple of Israel. Now, we'll study that moment when we get there later, but for now, we simply need to understand the arc of this man's rise to power. This man's end is also foretold in Daniel, since we know that he's destroyed by the arrival of Jesus at the end of the 7-year period. Paul also confirms that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Now, there's a restrainer in the world preventing the rise of the Antichrist. The Holy Spirit stands between Satan and his desire to rise up a false Christ through whom the enemy might gain the world's worship. God's purpose in causing his spirit to indwell the believer during the church age is partly a result of the need to hold back Satan. Prior to Christ revealing in the man Jesus, Satan didn't have enough information to produce a counterfeit, so the indwelling ministry of the Holy Spirit wasn't required to stave off the rise of the Antichrist. He couldn't put himself in the place of Christ until there was a Christ revealed, upon which Satan could pattern his counterfeit claims. This also tells us that the church will never be in a position to identify this person. We don't need to go around perpetuating false accusations that each new political world leader is the Antichrist. Scripture says he will not be revealed until the restrainer has been removed. So Satan is focused on counterfeiting Jesus' death and resurrection, but the Holy Spirit indwelling in the church is obstructing his plan until the Spirit and the church are taken out of the way. And at that point, the lawless one will make his appearance upon the world in accordance with Satan's activity and power. Now, ironically, the rise of the Middle East peace broker backed by Satan only serves to bring the opposite of peace to earth. And we see that in Revelation chapter 6, verse 3. Let's read that together. "When he broke the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, 'Come.' And another, a red horse, went out, and to him who sat on it it was granted to take peace from earth, and that men would slay one another. And a great sword was given to him. Like the first seal, the opening of the second seal brings John a vision of another horse, and of course, the horse of a different color. This horse symbolizes something different, though it becomes apparent very quickly that the symbols are connected. The first white horse and rider symbolize the arrival of the Antichrist on the world stage. The horse was a symbol to communicate the arrival of something, or in this case, someone. Similarly, the horse of the second seal also communicates the arrival of something on earth. But the fact that it's another horse suggests we should see the horses as connected. Elsewhere in the seals and other judgments of Revelation, we don't see symbols repeated, but here they are repeated. So we got to ask the question, how are the horses related? Well, the second horse is red, the color of bloodshed, and in verse 4 we're told the effect of this horse and rider is to take peace from the earth. So, like the first horse, the second horse had a solo rider, this time carrying a sword. And we know there's only one Antichrist in tribulation. So that leads us to conclude that this second rider is not a second person. It's the same person we saw on the first horse. It's still the Antichrist. So the Antichrist rise to power is progressing with each new seal. So the first seal brought him on the world stage with the threat of war. Now the second seal has delivered on that threat with actual war breaking out. Men are slaying one another as war erupts on earth. So this is World War III breaking out, a new birth pang. Now, logically, it follows that the man who comes conquering and to conquer triggers war. But we understand these events are being controlled in heaven by God as he opens the seals. So the second seal is a second picture of the Antichrist as he consolidates power and begins to prosecute war on the world. And he leads the world into widespread bloodshed. And of course, we know what war brings, right? So, on the next episode, we will conclude the seals and we will move into chapter 7. All right. Thanks for listening. I really appreciate it. Again, this is not going to be a fast study. There will probably be close to 30 episodes just around Revelation, just so that we all have a really good understanding of it. So I know you might get a little frustrated with some of the details and backstory and stuff, but again, I don't want you to just take the podcaster's voice for what it is that I'm saying. Like, I want you guys to hear this and go and study it and look it up for yourselves, because it's really only going to make your faith stronger. That's going to help grow your relationship with Christ, because you're going to be spending time in the Word. You're going to be studying about what's happening, and that's just going to strengthen your faith. And hopefully, maybe God reveals something to you that hasn't already been revealed. I don't know. Or maybe it opens a door for you to share something with somebody, and that leads them to salvation as well. But thanks so much for listening. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's at BrandonTubbs24. If you want to follow me on Instagram, it's at okayestbrandon. And I will talk to you all next week. Have a great one.